Okay. Welcome to the Tennessee Native Plant Society's seminar, Native Plant Seminars series that we're doing monthly on the third Tuesday of the month. And this month we have for our speaker, Bart Jones, who is quite knowledgeable about our native orchids. And among other things, Bart is past president of Tennessee Native Plant Society. He's past president of the Memphis Orchid Society. And I'm sure he's got plenty of other accolades that we could heap on him, but those are the pertinent ones today. I'd like to say hello to everyone. Welcome. I'm going to ask that while Bart's talking that you please click your mute button. That's the button down on the lower left corner. And you want it to be red. You want it to be red in color.
Mute button to be red.
Lower left corner, click on it so it turns red. And that means there will be less feedback, less extra noise. So it makes it easier for all of us to hear Bart. And if you have a question or a comment, please put it down in the chat box, which is probably the middle of your screen, down at the bottom. And you can put it in there. And then when Bart's finished with his talk, what we're going to do is Bettina and I will be feeding Bart some of the questions and comments that people have made during his presentation. So Bart recently did an article for the, I don't know if it's going to show up, Tennessee Conservationist. No, not going to show up. The Tennessee Conservationist. He has a nice article in there on the native orchids of Tennessee. So be on the lookout. There's some good articles in the Tennessee Conservationist. And without further ado, I'm going to say, Bart, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Thanks everybody for joining us on the Zoom seminar. I hope this will not disappoint you too much. I'm going to try to remember to talk slowly, and hopefully you can hear me clearly over a few passing planes and any other kind of noise. The cicadas may start in here in a minute, so just try to ignore all the jungle sounds, but we will go on with the wild and wondrous world of orchid pollination. So people have been interested, hold on, this is not, there we go. People have been interested in orchids for hundreds of years, and during all this fascination, people noticed that a lot of orchids had very specialized methods of being pollinated by insects usually. And so people really began to study them. Orchids have always been more of a scientific endeavor in the plant world for a lot of people. And so a lot of scientists soon really started to look at how these plants were being pollinated and the methods that they were using to kind of utilize insects and have them do their bidding. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And to start with, I would like to kind of go over the basic parts of an orchid flower, because you're going to hear me use terms throughout the talk, and I want to make sure that you kind of understand the basic parts that we're talking about. So this is a Calopogon tuberosus, or a grass pink, and it has basically 6 floral petals or tepals. There's 2 petals that come out from the sides. There are 3 sepals, but there's also 1 petal that's been specialized. It doesn't look like the rest of the petals, the other 2 petals, and that we call a lip. In tuberosus, or in Calopogon here, you have the lip at the top, which is not the usual arrangement that an orchid has. These are called non-resupinate, and means they haven't turned upside down. So in reality, most orchid flowers that you see presented are upside down, and the lip's at the bottom. This one, for purposes of its pollination, has remained upright, and so it doesn't twist during the bud formation. But the lip is the attractant. That's where a lot of specialized features occur on the flower. And those are the things that are going to attract the insects in. Orchids are unique, and what is defining for the family is the structure of reproduction, which has become fused. So you have male and female parts fused into one structure called a column. You know, in most plants, you have stamens and anthers for the male part, and the pistil and style for the female parts, and the ovary, of course, where the seeds are located, or the ovules. And in an orchid, you have the pollinia and the style and stigma all into one structure, and it's called the column. And on the left, you can see the ovary is inferior, so it's below all the other parts of the flower. You can see this up close where the column has both the male and the female areas. So the stigma is kind of hidden underneath these flaps. You can't really see it, but that's where the sticky surface is, where the pollen is going to attach, and where the pollen will then form the tubes to go down into the ovary to fertilize the ovules. But the pollen, pollinia is what we call it. It's a package. The pollen is not individual grains in an orchid. It's usually packaged up in a clump in a discrete package called a pollinium. And there's usually two. There can be multiples, though. There can be 5, 6, depending on the genus. But most orchids have at least 2 pollinia. And they are usually stalked. And at the very end and the tip of that stalk is an extremely sticky pad called the basidium. And that's where it's going to attach to the insect. And the insect is going to pull that out from the structures where the pollinia are hidden, and then go to the next flower and hopefully pollinate. Orchids are notoriously poor reproducers. They go through this elaborate scheme of pollinating, and part of the result is that they don't have a very high success rate. But they go through all of this elaborate mechanism to assure that the genes are transferred to other flowers, that they don't self-pollinate very often. They do, but the preferred method, of course, would be to do cross-pollination. And so they would have a new mixture of genes in the next generation, which would lead to better vigor. Because if you're constantly just using the same genes in self-pollination, you start to amplify any kind of mutation that might be detrimental. And so the whole population tends to weaken over time. So they go through these elaborate schemes to ensure cross-fertilization. And this is a picture of some orchid seed. And orchid seed are unique in that they don't have any endosperm. So they're unlike any other seed. They're the embryo, and you can see in the kind of the center of the picture there where there's a dark spot. That's an actual embryo. And then there's this kind of husk around it that is called the testum or testa. And it's very lightweight and porous. And you can see they're only a few millimeters in length. So they're extremely tiny, and they can blow, you know, miles and miles and miles in the wind. And so orchids can disperse very quickly, very rapidly, and to a lot of different habitats. Of course, most of which are not going to be favorable. But another interesting thing, because they don't have an endosperm, that means that they're going to have to be able to find nutrition somehow when they're beginning to germinate. And so they accomplish this by a mutual symbiotic relationship with a mycorrhizal fungus. So as soon as the orchid seed lands somewhere, it has to have a fungal strand work its way into the testa and start to feed the embryo. And this symbiotic relationship in the wild lasts throughout the entire life of the orchid. You can artificially propagate orchid seed by giving them all the nutrients that they would need in the media that they're growing in. And then once they become adult photosynthetic plants, then they're fine without the fungus. But in the wild, these fungal patches will retain themselves on the roots of an adult orchid plant. And it probably just helps them to maintain a good nutritional uptake throughout their lifespan. But that in itself is another reason that orchids don't reproduce quite readily. So there's a lot of things that they overcome, and part of the overcoming is they produce thousands and thousands of seeds per pod. So there's mechanisms to balance, and orchids in general are pioneer plants. So they kind of like disturbed areas within their habitats, and that's where they're going to be able to germinate. All right, so probably the most famous example of how far an orchid will go to ensure its reproduction is, it's not a native, this is not a native orchid. These are found in Mediterranean Europe and North Africa. These are the ophises, or the bee orchids. This is the two-mooned orchid, Ophrys bilunulata. And what ophises have done is, through evolution and mutual mutualistic arrangements with bees, they fine-tune themselves so that they will be pollinated by one specific species. So this lip is kind of fuzzy and has markings on it. And of course, insects don't really see that much in acuity. They are generalists as far as they see colors and blotches and general shapes and forms, but they're not really that sharply attuned to what the visual cues are. So they kind of look like a female bee. And you can kind of see that. But they go a step beyond that. Instead of having a fragrance that humans smell, most of these Ophrys orchids have developed fragrances that mimic the female bee pheromones. So the males are attuned to, the pheromones as a sexual attractant, and they go right to where the orchids are blooming and think that these are female bees. And so they see that, land on them, and try to mate with them. And so the method of pollination for these orchids is called pseudocopulation, and it's done by these bees. And here's an example of an Andrena species of bee that's actually thinks it's mating with the flower. And you can see the pollinia are attached to its abdomen, and he's still, working away trying to find, the spot. And he will eventually stick that pollinia onto the surface of the stigma, and then the orchid will be pollinated. Or he'll go to another flower and carry that pollen and cross-pollinate. That's kind of the famous kind of exaggerated mechanism that an orchid will go through to ensure its pollination. But some of our native orchids are also just about as cunning as far as this goes. So there's basically 4 types of pollination strategies that our natives employ. The first is a nectar reward, which is what typically most flowers do. Most flowers will give a nectar reward to their pollinator, and that's what draws them in. Or it could be pollen. A lot of bees gather pollen, and so in the process of gathering pollen, they will also pollinate the flowers. And there are things that will attract the insects to that reward. And then there's also, in orchids specifically, a non-reward floral mimicry. So it takes a lot of energy for the plant to produce nectar. And so that energy can be better spent producing more seed. And so that's what orchids have done, is that they have foregone actually producing nectar, but they'll employ all of the other trappings of the flower that would signal that we're going to have, a reward if you come here. And they're using that to draw in the insect. And of course, the insect thinks that it's going to find the nectar and, goes in foraging and gets the pollen on it and pollinates flowers, but doesn't really get a reward for it. Then there's the floral traps. And these are actually mechanisms that temporarily trap or trick an insect into a situation that they don't expect. And that's how they will get the pollen on them. We'll go through those. It's hard to explain it until you actually see it. And then the fourth one is a method of self-pollination called cleistogamy. And cleistogamy means that as the flowers are being formed, they pollinate themselves before they even open. And cleistogamous flowers do not ever really open. And so they're pollinated and in bud, and then start to produce mature seed before they would be open, and they never open. And it's not the most efficient way. And like I said, over time, it will probably be detrimental to the population, but it is a way of ensuring that seed are produced. And a lot of clastogamous plants are relatively short-lived perennials. And there are some orchids that only live 2 or 3 years, and a lot of those will undergo clastogamy. All right, so we'll talk about those that give the nectar reward. And of course, most of these are going to be pollinated by butterflies and moths and bees. And each individual orchid has a fine-tuned set of structures that sort of limit to what, insect it can be pollinated by, either the length of the nectar spur, or the shape of the flower, or the size of the flower. And so you get different insects at different sizes that are pollinating different orchids. And most of those can be recognized by the long spurs where the nectar is contained. And so when you see an orchid that has a long spur, and if you look closely, you'll usually see that there's liquid in them, and it's typically only about 1/4 to 1/3 of that spur has nectar. So it kind of makes sure that the insect will go all the way in to be able to get all the nectar. And a lot of these flowers are also very fragrant, which also helps attract in the pollinators, especially the moths. So an example of some of these reward-giving orchids are the fringed orchids, or the platantheras. And the brightly colored species like this Platanthera ciliaris, they're orange or yellow or purple. Those are all pollinated by butterflies. Now, there are also white and green flowered platantheras, and those are usually pollinated by moths. And if anybody's familiar with some of these, you'll know that some have a fragrance, and those are typically the moth-pollinated ones. So this is an up-close view of the flower, and I'm going to try to use my cursor here to point, so bear with me. So the flower, the lip here, is got all these hairs, and what that probably facilitates is the ability for the butterfly to be able to hang on to the flower as it searches for the nectar. So this right up here is one of the nectar spurs. It looks very similar to the actual pedicel right here, but this is the spur that contains the nectar. And it's usually, like I said, just at the last quarter tip. Whoop, hit a button. Just wanting to go back. But right here is the opening to that nectar spur. You can see it's a little hole. And if you notice these two fangs on either side, well, that's the pollinia. There's a packet here and a packet there. And right at the very tip is that little sticky pad. So the butterfly is going to come in here, try to get the nectar. And I'm touching that too hard or something. Anyway, it's going to try to get the nectar. And as it gets to the end of the nectar, it's going to push forward as much as possible into that hole. And its head's going to go right in between those two fangs. And the pollinia are going to stick to either side of its head. This is the monkey face orchid, Platanthera integralabia. We're all familiar with that one. And this is one that's moth pollinated. And it's, if you've ever been around the monkey face orchids, you know that it has a very strong kind of vanilla almondy fragrance. It's a really nice fragrance, but that attracts moths. And also the white color, especially around dusk, will really show up. And so it attracts the moths. Now, I've seen butterflies at these too, but I think moths are probably the main pollinator. And again, you can see the pollinia. And here you can actually see the yellow where the actual packet is versus the white part, which is just the base structure that holds it in place. Also, the lips of the spurs are kind of tilted downward, and that helps facilitate an insect that's flying and not holding on. So the proboscis will just go straight down in, and you don't have to position yourself and hold your head straight up like the other one was almost a parallel spur. And here's a spice bush swallowtail showing you that it actually does work. And if you notice right here on the side of its head, usually they're stuck to the eye. There's the basidium right there. And then the packet of pollen is sticking up. And so it's pulled away from the flower. It's got pollen now, and it'll go to another flower. And hopefully as it goes in to feed, that pollen packet is going to stick to the sticky part of the stigma. And then the stigma will attach that and when it pulls back, the pollen will stay behind on the stigma, and then it will dissolve and the pollen grains will be released to do the fertilization. And a couple of other orchids that are also pollinated by moths include the showy orchis and the cranefly orchid. And of course, you know, cranefly orchids flowers are very small. And so it's small moths that fly around and do the pollination on those. And I've been out early in the mornings, and you can smell showy orchis. A lot of people don't realize they have a fragrance, but if you go early in the morning, and I'm assuming probably late in the afternoon at dusk time, it's kind of a spicy clove-like scent, and it's quite nice. And another orchid that is actually gives a reward. It's not a lot of nectar, but sporanthes, or the lady's tresses, at the base of the lip has a very small amount of nectar. And even though they don't have spurs, it's kind of a little sac back there at the very back of the lip. And you can see the opening right here. Now I've seen butterflies on them, but typically you will have bumblebees or other larger bees that will be the pollinator of these. And what they do is they've got a long tongue, but it's not as long as a butterfly proboscis. And so they work themselves to the flower, and the way that the sporanthes is formed, that lip kind of hinges down a little bit. So a bee will push its head in and separate the flower apart to get to that. And the column is at the very upper part of the dorsal sepal here. So right there in that bend is where the column is, and the pollen is in this area. So the bee pushes in, and it actually pushes in and puts the pollen, will connect to the back of the head usually as it pulls out. And there's an example here of a eastern common bumblebee, or common eastern bumblebee, that has a couple of the pollinia attached to the back of its head as it's pulled out of the flower. And so it'll go to the next flower, do that, and hopefully it'll contact the stigma, and the pollen will remove itself and pollinate the flower. You got to remember, all this stuff is very inefficient, though. A lot of insects will visit, get pollen on them, but it won't actually go back and be able to put that onto the stigma, or the stigma doesn't stick enough to pull it off of the insect. So it's an inefficient way, but it's a good way of assuring cross-fertilization between plants. And then we have the non-reward floral mimicry. And if you're, out in the field, you notice that a lot of flowers have these markings on their petals. And usually they're darker lines, and sometimes they are visible. And actually, sometimes we don't see them because they only show up in UV light, which is what a lot of insects see in. And so sometimes a flower doesn't appear to actually have any markings on it, but to an insect it does. And all of these little lines here in the catalpa and on the glade cress and here on the foxglove, they're basically drawing the insects into where either the nectar or the pollen is going to be. And a lot of these are tube-shaped flowers. And so the insect has to work in, and that's where the pollen will be dispersed onto the insect, even in these plants. So they have to work for it, but they get a reward at the end. And here's a Parnassus. And so even the green lines on the white background are an attractant to flies and bees, but particularly flies. So we have orchids that have over time developed a similar arrangement, but yet they don't produce pollen, or don't produce nectar as a reward. So if you notice, this is a spreading pogonia, Clystes bifaria. And if you look closely here, you see these, dark purple lines that are leading to this ridge of purple, which goes back into what now the two petals here, lateral petals, have formed what looks like a tube. And so that will lead the bee up through the flower to where the column is in this area where the pollen is. And they work in thinking they're going to get a nectar reward, and yet there isn't one, but they've already gotten pollen on them now. And then they'll go to the next flower and do the same thing, and in the process pollinate. Another one is the crested coral root. You can see the purple lines here. And in this one, the column is part of the tube, and then the lateral sepals kind of go to the side of it and form the area that the bee goes up. But right there, you can see the pollen packets. So it doesn't have to go very far in there to get the pollen on it. And then the shadow witch orchid, which employs the green lines on the white background. And these are pollinated by flies. And so the flies come and land on this. And you can see right here, the pollen is located here, and it's very flat. So the plant doesn't have to have anything other than the fly landing on it. And it may attach to its leg or its abdomen, but it will attach because just of the motion of the insect landing on the flower. And then it'll go to the next flower and so on and pass the pollen around. And then you've got the world begonia, the Isotria verticillata, which kind of employs both mechanisms. So if you look here on the lip, it's white, but it's got a nice green bumpy patch. So that's going to attract flies. It's also got these dark purple areas and lines that go back toward the column, which is just right there. And then the two lateral petals are forming the tube. And so that's kind of mimicking all that. But like, again, it doesn't have a nectar reward at the end for the insect. So it's just using what nature's already provided with other flowers to fool the insects to do what it's bidding for pollination. And then there are a lot of wildflowers that mimic the look or the smell of rotten meat, and that attracts pollinator flies. And a few of the plants that we're familiar with are the pawpaw, and you can see these are all either dark maroon or a purplish brown color, which mimics old meat that flies would be attracted to. And many of the flowers have an odor that is not pleasant, not necessarily rotten meat, but an unpleasant odor. Some don't, but they still have the coloration. And so that attracts the flies. And a couple of the orchids will do this too. So this is Southern Twayblade, Lystra australis. And as you can see, it's got that same deep red color. These are teeny tiny flowers, but if you look here, it kind of just looks like little shreds of meat hanging on a stem. And this one even has a little bit of a color pad that may attract the insects also. But these are all fly pollinated because you can see here's the column and the pollen right here. So it's very flat. So it just has to land on it and then have the pollen stick to it. Lily leaf twayblade, Leparis liliifolia, kind of the same thing, kind of this brown membranous looking flower. The flies land on that and the pollen's connected right there. So as they're kind of walking around here, they'll bump into that. Pollen will attach to it. Another thing too, there are species of Leparis that are pollinated by raindrops. So raindrops will hit the lip of the flower and it will jar the flower and the pollen will dislodge. And as the drop of rain that has the pollen on it evaporates, it pushes it back into where the stigma is. It's the only genus of orchids that kind of pollination mechanism is known. A lot of orchids also, as they age and senesce the flowers, they will dry up and release the pollen, and some will actually self-fertilize that way. And some of these Leparises will do that. So the pollen kind of dries up and dislodges and falls back down on the lip, and through either action of insects landing on it or the wind or whatever will push it back into the stigma. And occasionally you will get some self-pollination that way. And then there are the floral traps. And these are the ones that people really love because it's just ingenious and elegant, the way that they've developed their flowers to be able to ensnare an insect to do its pollination bidding. And so we'll go back to our friend, the grass pink, Calopogon tuberosus. And like I said, it has a little bit of an unusual structure for an orchid, and you'll see why here. So if you look here, this is an up close view of the lip, and it's pretty obvious that these little hair-like projections are mimicking stamens and pollen, anthers, so it looks like the stamens of a flower, and that's going to attract the bee. So the bee is going to land up here thinking, oh, this is pollen. Well, when it lands, and of course, a small bumblebee is still pretty heavy when it comes to a flower. And if you look right here, there's a notch, and that's called the hinge. And up here is a closer view of it, and it's hard to see here, but there is a line of pale color, which is actually an area where there's much fewer cells stacked on each other, so it's a weak point. And what happens is the bee will land here, and the weight will trigger the collapse of that lip. And so where the bees landed will fall completely back down onto this area where the pollen is and on the column. So this is the structure of this flower is specifically designed to be able to handle a bee as it falls back. When the hinge breaks, it doesn't break, it just bends. But when that hinge goes, the bee falls, its back hits the pollen sticks to it, and of course it flies off. And then we have the lady slippers, and they're also insect traps. So this is Cypripedium kentuckiense, and this is a close-up view of what we call the pouch or the slipper. And if you notice, you can see right here, there's the opening, and that opening goes all the way around. But you also notice there's this flap that hangs back down within the pouch, and that completely surrounds this. So it's almost like a fish trap in that there's a funnel in, but because that sticks inward, and then the insect can't get back out that way because the flap is kind of forcing it to not be able to get back out that way. So if you look here, there are some clear areas on the back side of the pouch, and those act as windows and kind of let light in. So the most light's coming here, and the insect will probably try to go right back out where it came in, but it can't. But here it sees more light, so it says, okay, I'm going to go this way. And if you notice here, there's all these little hairs. Well, this streak of hair goes all the way down the back side of the lip. And that's the only way, because all the other part of the inside of the lip is very smooth and they can't really climb out. So they go up through here, and this is the only opening, this little area right here. They're going to have to squeeze themselves through there to get out. And right there is the pollen package. And these Pollinia don't really have a basidium. The pollen's like a really sticky goo. And so as they work their way past, the pollen will kind of stick to the backside of the bee. And right behind here, this is what they call a staminode, and that's kind of unique to lady slippers, and that kind of helps keep this pouch from being able to be opened up before then, and it forces it to go out this way. But right behind this is where the stigma is. So it's going to get pollen stuck to it the first time it goes through. It's pretty traumatic for a bee, if you can imagine. So they're going to have to do this all over again. And a lot of bees learn right away, this isn't worth it. This flower didn't have anything but just a hard time. So they're not going to go back. But occasionally you get a bee that's a little naive still and will go back to a second flower. And that's the ones that are doing the pollination. So the Cypripedium kentuckiense grows up on our farm in Parsons, and I kind of monitored these plants for about 20-25 years, pretty much every year. And I would have occasionally go up and hand pollinate a few. I'd take the pollen from one and go to another flower and pollinate that by hand. And I was trying to increase the population, but I never saw any pods seed pods that were formed naturally until one year. every single flower that bloomed had a seed pod. And I didn't do any pollination that year myself. So I don't know. I've read a lot about pollination in the cypripediums and talked to some people. And it seems like that a lot of times the flowers don't time up well with the bee emergence. And so by the time that the naive bees have come out, they've learned to go to other flowers. So I think that there's a lot of years where the pollinators just don't even visit lady slippers. And that's why they're so difficult to spread, and kind of probably leads to a lot of their rarity. But it's just an interesting side note that they seem to rarely get pollinated by natural means. But when it does happen, it seems to be very efficient. And this is the pink lady slipper. It has a slightly different arrangement, although the mechanisms are the same. So if you look here, it's got these dark lines, which is another thing like before, the mimicry, which says, you know, come here, but it has an extremely small opening. So it's not big enough for a bee. But if you've ever, you know, played and touched with a lady slipper pouch or a pink lady slipper pouch, you'll know that it's very flexible and loose. And this is actually a slit. So it's actually the opening goes all the way down the length of the pouch, but it's kind of closed off with that flap that hangs back down. So what happens is the bumblebee will come here because of the lines, and it says, oh, here's the opening, and it will work its way through. And if you've noticed bumblebees working, you know, some of the snapdragons and flowers like that, they push their way into the flower to get to the nectar. And so that's what it's doing with the pink lady slipper. It'll push its way in, but then it gets trapped, and there's no way it can get back out, even if it's flexible. These flaps don't go back out. And so he has to come back out the top here. And so here's the opening here on the back side of the pouch. So it's going to have to go out that way. And of course, get the pollen on it. And then the last strategy that our native orchids are utilizing is cleistogamy. And it's rare. It's not, like I said, it's not the most favorable way to maintain a population. So cleistogamous flowers are not the first choice, but they do happen, and they happen in a lot of different wildflowers. Most notably, there are several peas that do that. One of the things that does that is a peanut. A peanut is actually a cleistogamous flower. So we're eating the seeds from a cleistogamous flower when we eat a peanut. Several grasses will do this, and also violets. Violets are very notorious for cleistogamous flowers. And so this is a diagram of a violet. This was the flower that opened up in the early spring and was fertilized by, you know, normal means and cross-pollination more than likely. And it's already dehisced and the seeds have dispersed from the fruit capsule. But now it's later in summer, and kind of as an insurance that it's going to be able to reproduce, it sends out these cleistogamous flowers. And these don't ever open. They look like a seed pod as they're forming. And they just make seed. They don't have petals or anything like that. And then they will rupture later on and disperse seed. Of course, these are all self-pollinated. So it's not the preferred way, but it will work. And especially if it didn't get pollinated earlier when it had the normal open flower. So in orchids, you get some of the sporanthes will do this. This is the oval lady tresses, or Sporanthes ovalis. And you'll notice that these flowers just look like buds. And you can also tell that the ovaries are already swelling up, and the flowers really never completely open up. They may break a little bit open, but not enough for anything to get in. And so these are going to be self-pollinating. And a lot of times these orchids will do this if the conditions are not right. And they haven't been able to manufacture nectar, the energy. They don't want to expend that much energy to form open flowers and produce nectar. So they'll just do these cleistogamous flowers. And probably the one that most people are familiar with is the coral roots, and especially fall coral root. And fall coral root will actually rarely produce open flowers. Most of the time when you encounter these out, you will see the clastogamous flowers. And so this is the flower right there, that little nub, and it's already produced, a seed capsule as it's maturing. And so that's how it does its thing, is just basically self-pollination over and over. And when conditions are perfect, then they'll produce open flowers and hope for cross-pollination to maintain the gene diversity within the population there. And so that's how our native orchids employ different strategies to ensure reproduction. A lot of them are very elaborate, elegant traps. Some just give you nectar like normal flowers, and others are going to be self-pollinating flowers that never open. And with that, I thank you very much. And we'll start with any questions that anybody might have.
Wow. Thank you, Bart. I've been around orchids all my life. I found my first pink lady slipper back when I was, maybe 7 or 8 years old, but I've never knew how they pollinated. So thank you. Mark H says, fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Thank
Jerry
you.
Joyce, fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, I enjoyed very much. This is Edwin and Nichols, and I do have a question.
Okay. Fire away.
Well, that
On the self
Bart, that was fantastic, and all a lot of stuff were back to things that I have learned over the decades. And on the Tipularia discolor, the arrangement of flowers is such that they cannot go easily from one flower crossways to the other. So if you think you have the arrangement one on top of the other interspaced, that's when that particular moss is supposedly going straight up that one line and not go zigzag from one to the other. I read that on one of the literatures.
Yep. And they're also slightly nodding, which also makes it difficult to go from one flower up to another one.
Absolute.
Yep.
And you try to take pictures of them, and that's a challenge on its own. But the symmetry and asymmetry in the arrangement of those flowers and others too, but that's just terrific.
Yep. Yep.
This is Edwin and Nichols. And I have about the pods on the self-pollinators. Can you from the pod, if you take it off of the plant?
Yeah, I mean, orchids are very difficult to, raise from seed. Like I said, an orchid seed has to have that mycorrhizal fungal partner. So if you don't have the correct fungus, and that's why it's if you want to try to raise babies, it's better to just let the seed pods, burst and fall in the area where the orchids are already located, because you know that if the orchid is there, you're going to have that fungus present. And so it would be very difficult to try to take that pod and then move it somewhere else and try to plant the seed. And you don't really plant the seed. They just have to fall down into the top of the soil and under the leaf litter and all that. But yeah.
Okay, now I have mine in the bark and the other stuff that holds the moisture. So the seeds drop on my orchids. Is that where they go? And they're going to produce more into that medium, or do I need to have them in some kind of dirt?
Well, like I said, to grow terrestrials, I only know of one terrestrial orchid that's grown in cultivation that really is fairly easy to propagate, and I've done it, and that's Sonorchis fastigiata. And it's one of those that when you let them go to seed and the pod pops open and the seed disperses, it will come up in all of your pots. It's very prolific.
Okay.
Any other type of orchid, I mean, you can occasionally, and that's how when they originally started to try to propagate orchids, that's what they would do, is they would let the seed pod burst and the seed fall down into the pot where the mother plant was. And occasionally, a rare occasion, they would get a seedling come up. Now, another thing about an orchid is the first year of an orchid's life, you don't see anything. Because when it germinates, it basically just makes a ball of cells. And then the second year, it will start to make leaves and roots.
Okay.
And then it will grow from then on as, you know, a normal plant. But that first year, it's basically a mass of cells. And eventually they start to grow a leaf out from that mass and then roots.
Okay.
So that's why most people do all of the, any kind of seed germination. They do it in sterile tissue culture with media that contains all the nutrients. They don't worry about the fungus. That's why it's basically a professional lab job that people that work on orchid propagation. It's difficult.
Okay.
All right, we have a comment from Mrs. Bob Davis. She says, we have Sporanthes in our yard every year, but not always in the same place. What's up with that?
Well, like I said, you know, Sporanthes are probably one of these short-lived perennials. So a Sporanthes plant, individual plant, probably doesn't live more than 4 or 5 years. And so that's one of the reasons that you get to this clastogamous method, because if the plant's getting older and it's not been producing seed pods, it may revert to this clastomony to ensure that it can reproduce, and then it may die off. You know, a lot of plants may live several years until they're old enough to reproduce, and then after they reproduce, they die. I'm not saying that an orchid does that, but some of these short-lived perennials, they don't have a lot of flowering seasons in them. And so what'll happen is you may have Sporanthes come up in one spot for a year or two, they bloom, and then they die. And then they'll come up in another location from seed from a year or two ago, and then they'll bloom. So it's this constant flux within the area, but not in the exact location.
What about the time from seed to flowering?
Of course, that's going to depend on different species, but in general, orchids are a little bit like trilliums. It's going to take 5 to 7 years. Some are faster. Some of the smaller, like Sporanthes, will probably bloom within 3 years, probably.
And then we have another question. Can you talk about the soil characteristics needed for orchids? Why are they so hard to move?
Well, the main thing is just because the fungal association is still there. And if you move the plant to a different location, it could also be that you're killing the fungus more so than you're killing the plant. And once the fungus is dead, the plant may not thrive as well. Also, the conditions, you know, orchids are going to grow where they're happy. And that's what I'm saying. Transplanting plants away from where they're growing to a different location where they're not growing probably means that location's not as good. And so the more sensitive the plant is to that, the more likely it's not going to transplant. And orchids kind of fall into that territory. So if you're going to try to do that, you need to bring a lot. And I do not advocate moving orchids, especially the lady slippers. They're too rare and they don't transplant well at all. People have tried with pink lady slippers, and unless you've got pine woods and acid soil, you're wasting your time. So I don't advocate for that, but maybe a Sporanthes or a Tipularia, which is a common plant, they're not going to live a long time anyway. You could try to move those. But if you do, you need to be sure to bring a lot of the native soil that it was growing in to begin with, and make sure that it's got the same kind of drainage. So if it was a dry location, you definitely need to put it in a relatively dry location. If it was a moist location, it has to be moist. You need to try to mimic the conditions as much as you can.
Here's one from Rita.
Go ahead, Karen.
If the bees, whoops, let's see here. If the bees can learn not to return again and again to the lady slippers, why do you think they don't learn from the non-floral mimicry of the spreading begonia?
They probably do. But you also got to remember too that all flowers, even the ones that produce nectar, they produce nectar at different times of the day. If an insect has already visited that flower, it may not have nectar. So it's not like it's just a complete turnoff not to get nectar from one flower. Now, if they repeatedly went to that same type of flower over and over and never got nectar, yeah, they might finally give up on that. But yeah, I mean, and yeah, like I said, orchids are not, it's not efficient. They're using these insects, but they're pretty harsh methods of using them. And so they learn pretty quick that I'm not getting anything out of this. And so, yeah, you don't get orchid pollination on every plant.
All right. Barrett Brannon says, great presentation. Pretty fascinating to think these orchids would not exist if the fungus didn't provide energy to the seeds.
Yep.
And another one says, colonies of Goodyeria can be seen on numerous wooded trails, so they like that place.
I didn't hear what genus.
Goodyear.
Oh, Goodyear. Okay. Yeah. And Goodyear is one of the really more common orchids. And like I said, orchids in a way are pioneer plants. We don't think of them that way because we think that they're real finicky and picky. And in a way they are, but they also kind of depend on that disturbance. And so Goodyeras will grow right along a trail that, you know, kind of gets kicked up a little bit every so often.
Mhm.
And then John White comments that maybe the answer to the question about the non-learning bees is bees as a whole don't live that long. So maybe new naive bees will come to the orchids.
Good thought. Any more questions?
The koala hits
So
Corallohitza wisteriana. I got so excited when 1959 or 61, I found it on the mountain, used to mark it, and never was it coming up at the next year on that spot. And also all vegetation is changing at any spot. So it gets denser and other things will crowd in and crowd other plants, especially orchids, crowd them out with the forest and so. But as Talame talks about the oak forest, so the Wisteriana was very prevalent at those times, but it has over the decades disappeared
yeah,
from the mountain.
and another thing about coral roots, because they're not photosynthetic and they're not parasites, but they're saprophytic.
They're saprophytes, right?
Yeah, so they get their energy from decaying organic matter. And if you can imagine, if you had to live on rotting stuff all the time, that it would probably take you a long time to gain enough energy to be able to bloom. And so the only time that you ever see a coral root is when it's blooming. The rest of the time, and it may be years, you know, several years in between the time it can bloom. So it's underground. And so that's what happens a lot of times. People will see a coral root and they see it when it's in flower, go and mark it, and then it may not be there for the next several years. And they give up, think it's dead. And it could just be that it's doing its thing underground, gaining energy, and then 10 years later, it blooms again in that spot, or it may die out.
That's what they also don't have chlorophyll.
Right. So, I mean, it's an
The
odd
saprophytes.
orchid. And that's another reason why they believe that a lot of the coral roots will do the clastogamy, because when they do bloom, they have to ensure that they've gotten their job accomplished, because they may not bloom again.
Any other questions?
Uh,
Bart, I think this was fabulous. It was fun. I sure learned a lot, and I appreciate the work that you put into this presentation. It was a good one.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Lots of comments here now suddenly.
Oh, they just all, mostly
That's
they're,
great. Thanks so much. This type of study is much needed for other wildflower families. That's from Rita. Hunter Oppenheimer, just fascinating. Thank you. Sarah Thomas, so interesting. Thank you. Ken Ree, good presentation. Dana DeLoca, thanks for the wonderful presentation. John White, great photographs. They are. Thank you, Bart. Much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Very good.
So,
yeah, but I could continue that discussion with you from now until infinity.
Isn't that the great thing about plants?
yes. Oh, well, thank you very much. With that, folks, I'm going to say good night.
Night.
Thank you for
Right.
coming, and we've enjoyed everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
All right.
Thank you,
Bye.
Bart.
Good night. Thank you.
Good
Go.
night and thank you. And I found it, Karen, I found it under search.
Thank you. Glad you did.
Right.
All right.
Don't know where it had gone in the meanwhile.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Good
But
night.
good night. And Bart, I'm going to call you soon on a
Okay.
fascinating bug,
Okay.
which you won't know all its
Oh, okay.
detail because I read it in the German book,
Oh, well, yeah, I won't know
the
that.
details.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Shirley, are you still there?
You're muted.
You unmute yourself. I could hear you.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, you unmuted yourself.
I did.
And anyway, I hooked in a little